Welcome to the Modern Husbands podcast, where every other week we host national thought leaders to discuss how spouses can partner to manage money and the home to live happier lives. Today we welcome David Yuan, and our focus is masculinity and men's well being. David is a managing partner at the MindKind Institute, where he coaches and facilitates leaders and their teams in self awareness, well being, mindfulness, emotional intelligence, and conscious communication. David is also an award winning strategist who has led organizational and cultural redesigns for Fortune 100 companies, fast companies, most innovative companies, and the public education sector. Enjoy the podcast.
Perfect. So welcome to the Modern Husbands podcast. So excited to see you. So thrilled that you're here. Tell us about your work, MindKind and beyond. I'm really excited to hear about it.
Yeah, sure. So our work is actually centered around well-being and healing. And the way that we approach that is through the body. So if you were to picture the intersection between work and life, that is the intersection that we work at. Because we believe that well-being is something that you don't have to wait until the weekend is here or vacation is here, or I'm finally done with work and I can actually kick back and relax. Then I can practice well-being, or that I don't have to put a pause on who I am as a person, what's meaningful for me, and bring my sense of my whole self to work, right? And so for us, we're really interested in that intersection because there's a lot of creativity that happens in that space. There's a lot of authentic relationships that happens in that space. And quite frankly, I think it's the space that we strive for in terms of the aspirational job or the work environment that we hope for mirrors something in our personal life. So our work is really centered around that. And so we do that, with organizations like the World Bank. We work in government groups. We work in, Department of Education, and we also work with, interestingly enough, accountants and lawyers who have sort of run the marathon for so long and realized that, some of their the ways in thinking of how to implement well-being are not exactly working what they had hoped. So that's the work we do at MindKind. Oh, go ahead, Brian.
Yeah, I mean, for our listeners' sake, help me understand first, how do you define well-being? And then I want to dive back into that intersection between, kind of work life and bringing well-being, not just within your personal life, but within your professional life. So how do you define well-being? Let's start there.
Yeah, it's an interesting question because it can be defined in so many different ways. But I think I'll first just illustrate an example, a story, first and foremost. So we were at a retreat at Kripalu, which some of you might know is a yoga and health center in Stockbridge, Massachusetts. We ran a retreat for educators, and there was this particular teacher who was there. She used to be a former NYPD officer, and so someone who had obviously gone through a lot of trauma in the system, who'd been on many different sides of it and became a teacher, right? And so she reflected during the retreat that she was in her room the night after all the sessions had been done. She was sitting in front of her bed and she was looking at the mirror. And she told me that for the first time in her life, she felt like the person staring back at her, like she could actually love and feel connected to. Like for the first time in her life, she didn't see someone with shame or guilt or unkindness looking back, and so for me, is that well-being? Is that healing? So for me, when I see that, when I listen to those kind of stories, I see someone who's made contact with themselves, right? What is the point of all these experiences that we have in life if not to make meaning and to find a sense of purpose through it all? And I think a lot of the illnesses happen in life because we've been becoming more distant with who we are as people and then slowly becoming more isolated and more empty and unable to relate to the world and why things we do matter. And so I think for me, well-being exists in a space where people can make contact with themselves, make meaning of what's important to them, and then make the right choices that address that. So well-being is a process of tapping into a person's own inner capacity to be self-aware and make choices for what's most important. That's probably how I would define it.
As you were illustrating that story, I was thinking about, myself and how in my professional career, it doesn't matter or never really mattered what I accomplished. I never really felt great or rarely felt great about anything because I was so focused on the next thing, like what it was that I did wrong that I need to improve.
Yeah.
And I think that what you just said, I'm sure would resonate with a lot of men in their role as a husband too, particularly in 2022, when the way in which a household is structured is very different than in 1922. Christian, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, no, I mean, my first connection to what David was talking about was I actually grew up very close to Kripalu, very close to Stockbridge, Mass. It's a beautiful part of the world. So my first reflection was on like, geez, what a privilege to have grown up in such a bucolic, part of the world. And I often reflect on how the various privileges that I have, whether that's racial or geographic or just like the circumstances of my youth, I very often reflect on like how those privileges, come off externally, and very often also judge. I'm looking at the mirror. Unlike the women in the anecdote here, I'm very often looking at the mirror and thinking, "Oh gosh, you didn't actually achieve that thing, like that professional accomplishment, that that accolade, etc. That was handed to you as part of this, series of privileges that you have, which may in many cases be true, but it's also like an unfair way to judge yourself and like guide yourself through decisions in life. So I was kind of selfishly reflecting on how I could use what David shared in my own life, that definition of wellness as a an honest self-reflection and feeling of self-love. It's pretty powerful. I would love to go back to talk more about your work, your men's work, specifically, David, and this can be beyond your work at MindKind Institute. I know you've been really active in starting and fostering men's groups in your local community. So yeah, would love to hear about all of that as well.
Yeah. Before I share about your question, I want to just like add on to what you were saying about well-being when you're talking about the other side of it, right? So with that woman staring in the mirror, she was seeing this sort of like deficit, like lack, right? There's something that she doesn't have, and it's being judged by the person looking back at her, right? And then for you were talking about another spectrum of it, which was privilege, right? Like, and so I want to just like underline this word so we can return back to it. Wholeness. Like, what does it mean to be whole, to experience wholeness? Because I think that's so intricately tied with the experience of well-being. And then I'll tie it to this men's group work, because I would say that's the premise of the men's work. I think, Brian, what you said earlier in this call before we got on, you were talking about how a lot of studies have recently shown the number of men who feel isolated is increasing, right? Yeah. And, I certainly experienced that for myself and have experienced that tremendously. just being a product of being a man, living with all the ideas of who I should be, how I should act, and then if I act differently, is there a system or a culture that would support me and catch me, right? And you talked about this pendulum swing, right?
Yeah.
So MindKind's work is really around, the big one is actually around talking about shame.
Say more.
Yeah. So I think there's this, like, I grew up with this idea that you need to shoulder the burden, you need to suck it up.
Yeah.
You know, my father, who was he grew up with a father that divorced 3 times and was not really available. He had to learn to sort of like pick himself up by his own bootstraps whenever he got injured, take himself to the hospital, that kind of dynamic, right? And so growing up, I always felt like, okay, well, you just need to suck it up. Life is hard. You don't really talk about, you don't really show your weakness or your vulnerability because you need to be the provider, right? And I think the blind spot with that is that then you don't actually reveal who you are. You don't actually reveal the things that you're actually secretly feeling, or even acknowledge that to yourself. And I think actually for me, what is at the root of what's happening with men today is our inability to be forthcoming about our own shame and to sort of like out ourselves. So in our work, actually, we sort of call it like a outing yourselves dojo. And so we come to the calls and we use that space to air out the things that we have a lot of guilt or shame about. And the process is actually quite freeing. Not that we say we're going to air our shame as a way to release ourselves of any responsibility, but as a way so that it's not hidden in the closet, and then we're not over calibrating our behaviors as a response to protect against the thing that we're shameful about, you know?
Yeah, and I'm glad that you explained that process, because I think it is important that we all start with, you know, we're not transferring personal responsibility somewhere else. I struggle with this personally, right? Like in my own mind, just suck it up. You just kind of grind through. So I would love it if you would give a particular example of, you know, like a common challenge, common shame that men in their 30s might feel and how they would work through that process.
Yeah. Well, before I answer that question, I would love to hear a little bit more on like, what does that struggle look like for you?
Yeah, I mean, I think just for me, if there's, you know, adversity, you just, I don't know what to say, just grew up in a rural, small, you know, town in Ohio, and you just, we called it man up, which is probably not an appropriate thing to say in 2022, but you just do it. Yeah, I mean, yeah, it's like you're a human tea kettle, you know, and then and you just keep going and going and going, and then eventually it's at a boiling point and you've got to do something. But yeah, I've never been able to really find a way to kind of work through challenges without just deciding I'm going to put my head down and kind of plow through it. So I'm here as much as anyone else to learn. I'm certainly not an expert when it comes to that.
Yeah. Well, I will attempt to answer this question in 2 different ways. The first one is actually in relationship to our partners, our spouses, or our significant others, or just people that are in our lives that are really close to us. I just got a curiosity between you, Brian, and Christian, like, how many of you can resonate with sort of an argument with your significant other where you've maybe once or twice heard the feedback, like, I'm not sure you're hearing me correctly.
So I think you just explained every argument.
Certainly heard that feedback before. Yeah.
Right. You just don't get it. You just don't see me. You're just you're not really hearing me. You're not really listening. You know.
Right.
Right. And I say that from personal experience. You know, like to this day, I still go to couples therapy, and which is to talk about that very subject, right? Where most of it is actually about how we listen. And so I think this sort of like age-old dynamic of just man up is about plowing through and getting to solutions really fast, and not really like pausing to really settle in and self-reflect and see what emerges. I think this sort of like, let's just get it done. It's sort of like a black and white way of looking at things, right? Because I think it tends to solve for one scenario as opposed to considering very diverse perspectives. So for example, this scenario could be around, I just need to get it done because it's urgent and I'm feeling anxious. And so I'm just serving the master of urgency and anxiety and not taking a pause to see, is there a different way that we could be engaging with this thing all together? And in the case of like a relationship, how many of you, the both of you, have heard the feedback like, I don't need you to solve this.
Did you talk to my wife before this podcast?
Right. Yeah, I did a little bit of digging. I did a little homework.
David comes prepared to the podcast.
Yeah. Yeah. I've interviewed both of your wives. Yeah.
Oh yeah. Please explain, because I have yet to figure out like you're presenting a problem. Let's just get to the solution. I don't quite understand all the stuff in between. So I'm glad that we're having this conversation for if anything else for my benefit, even more so my wife's. So please continue.
Yeah. Christian, were you going to say something? I don't want to launch it. You were about to say something.
I was just gonna power through and crack a stupid joke, but because we're learning about, being more thoughtful about the way that we communicate and listen, we'll pause, carry on.
And Christian doesn't have any. He's really good at that. That's like, I can assure you that is a strength in his relationship. He's so thoughtful, where I'm like, let's just get after it and figure it out. Please tell me, because I know that it's not the correct approach to managing conflict in a marriage.
But this is all on a sliding scale too, right? Like there is
that's true.
We were talking offline earlier about, there is no such thing as a perfect partner, perfect husband, perfect wife, perfect, spouse, whatever.
Yeah.
We're all working together to get better from wherever we are and along that sliding scale. Then some, if we get to the top of that sliding scale, the farthest we can go on that sliding scale, there's still going to be stuff we are, we have our heads in the sand about. And so, that's why I love these conversations. It's a great way to triangulate kind of where we are, talk through some of the challenges together, and push, push forward with a partnership mentality, with a growth mentality as well. So Brian, stop beating yourself up, brother.
Yeah. And I think these are all like, there's a saying, the way you do something is the way you do anything, right? And I think that really connects to integrity. And I think you're actually making a lot of interesting points. And we'll connect back to Brian's question. I think it's really hard for as a man, just look at how like sort of conventional ideas of what it meant to be a man was, and not pendulum swing, right? To say like, I renounce the sort of wave being that's like just push through, and I'm just going to do this other thing, right? And I think that developmentally, like that is just a very common path. It's like something wasn't working, so I'm just going to pathologize the whole thing as bad, and I'm going to swing to the other side and do something completely different. But I think it's important to name that there are moments when the response is a solution, to go straight to the solution, right?
Are you saying this to make me feel better, to know that at least half the time I'm right?
Well, I'd have to talk to your wife to really get the answer. Yeah, yeah, that'll come in the debrief with her. But I think, just to go back to you to your question, Brian, I think that what is the alternative besides presenting a solution? What is the alternative besides coming to a conflict with your partner by simply pushing through to the solution to the other side? Well, the other options are, one, am I willing to sit in the discomfort and the uncertainty that this conflict raises for me? Am I willing for that? Right? Am I willing to not be in control? Because pushing through and manning up is all about this sort of like aggressive, it's on me and I can do whatever it takes to change the situation, you know?
That's true.
But sometimes it's not up to you.
Yep.
And sometimes it's actually not even about you, you know? And so I think that's one. I think the second is like, how often do we ask our partners, the people in our lives, before we present them with a solution or what we think they should do, what they actually need? What do you need from me right now? What do you need that you might not have raised, or perhaps I might not know about, or perhaps I might not have acknowledged? Christian, are you gonna say something?
No, I'm just fascinated that you raised this. I feel like my partner, Chelsea, is really good about communicating the answer to that question without me asking. And I just wonder how much better of a communicator I could become if I started with that question rather than relying solely on Chelsea to already have the answer to it. Like, she knows what she needs from me. We're coming into a conflict. She knows, but I'm not necessarily in that mindset when I come in. So I just wanted to appreciate you for sharing that insight. That's a really good tip.
Yeah, I've noticed that my wife, like, which for those people that don't know me, I just got married actually about a month ago.
Congratulations.
Yeah, thank you. Our conflicts, 9 times out of 10, the only thing that she's looking for from me is just listening. Is just to listen. And actually, most of the relationships that I've had, that was it. And the other times that they've needed sort of like advice or suggestion or solution, they've been actually pretty forthcoming about it. You know, and so most of my misfires have come because I didn't check in with my partner about what they need from this conversation, from me in this moment. What sort of presence are they requesting of me? You know, how often do we come to conversations thinking that this person needs this, making an assumption about that, and then holding that space for that instead of what they actually are looking for? And in those times that I have succeeded, because I don't succeed all the time, in listening to my partner, I'm actually always quite astounded at how often my partner is able to just find resolution for herself, or just come away feeling more inspired, more empowered than I could have by encouraging her. You know, like, all I did in those moments was just simply listen, repeat back what I heard, ask questions, and that was simply it.
Do you think that some of the challenges that men are facing now have to do with, you know, having the mindset that I have, or I don't have it all the time. I'm not completely terrible, but that they struggle with kind of working through some of these challenges, and particularly when, you know, now the household structure is one in which both are working. You know, both partners are working. Both partners can be stressed out, lack time, and at least I have found this when I'm facing time scarcity,
like that's when I want to get to the conclusion, to the response as fast as possible. I just don't, in my own mind, I'm thinking, I don't want to work through feelings. I just want to get to the solution, which is, I recognize is not the appropriate path. Do you think that that might have something to do with the challenges that men are facing now?
I think that I will just speak from personal experience, like, and from the men that I've spoken to and been around. Sitting with like really challenging feelings, I think, is really hard as a man, and I think that as men, there is this ideology, especially when it comes to our significant other, that we're supposed to be sort of like heroes, you know. Like
Right.
we hear the narrative, like saving the damsel in distress, or chivalry, for example, even chivalry as a concept, right? And not that those things are necessarily bad, because sometimes it makes sense to sort of like step into those roles, because that's what's being called for, either by the partners or by the situation. But I think this sort of like this challenge with being with difficult feelings and emotions, like, cuts us off from our ability to sort of, on the other side of pushing through, is just to hold space for people. Like, be an open container where someone can walk into your living room, as a metaphor, right? Your work partner, your colleague, your friend, your significant other can walk into this sort of like this living room, as a metaphor, space that you've created, where they can just feel safe to belong, even if they have an uncomfortable emotion they need to work through with you, or even want a voice. If I myself, I've noticed every time that I've said, like, I don't have time for this, we just got to move on. Either I said it in my head or said it to them, like verbally. There's two things that happen. The first thing that happens is actually the emotion or feeling doesn't go away, and it actually makes the work much harder. Like, whatever we're trying to attend to now, it's not like it disappears. It just actually makes things less efficient. So there's that. There is a second response that—
And that's an important point.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, no, that's an important point. I want to stress that if you don't work through the process appropriately, it actually makes things worse. It takes longer to get to the problem and solve it, even if you even do. So I'm glad you pointed that out. Go ahead.
Yeah, but on the flip side, sometimes it's like, if there's a deadline, like if you, Brian, Christian, and I, in 30 minutes, we have a deadline to do X, Y, and Z, to file some paperwork or whatever. And we're not able to do that because the three of us are feeling just so dysregulated in our emotions, meaning we can't manage our internal emotions, and they're just spewing out, and we're just spiraling, and we can't get something really important done. There is a case to be said that, hey, can we put a pause on, let's acknowledge what's happening in the space right now. I'm feeling anxious. I feel concern and worry, and I have maybe even anger about how this process is going. And you just want to name that, but let's put it aside and put a pause on it so we can come back to it, so that we can prioritize moving this thing through. Because the three of us have said this is the most important thing we need to get done, but we're not ignoring it, we're naming it, and then we're parking it for later so we can return back to it. So I think that's another strategy that people can use.
It's a really good strategy. And what a middle ground too. Like, to your point earlier, David, about, when we anticipate that something we were doing or something that was expected of us as men from the past was wrong or is wrong, and you have that pendulum swing moment, which might not be the best way to process through that change and that challenge. this is a middle ground approach, a middle ground strategy that I will personally find really helpful in my in my life, and in the disagreements and challenging conversations I have with my wife. So again, I'm like the little appreciation genie over here. I just sit here and give people kudos and props and thanks. Brian's got the tough job asking the tough questions.
I gotta say, as I'm listening to David, like the one thing I'm thinking about that I want it to work, but I don't know, is what or where are we going to eat? Because it always feels like it's a 50-minute, just like, it doesn't matter what I say. I'm just throwing things against the wall to hope that they stick. And I just never feel like that I can hit, but bad. just a joke. I love the fact that you recognize that there are times where like you do have to kind of get through something, but I had not considered the strategy of just saying, look, we're both anxious, we're both frustrated, we both need to solve a problem, but for right now, let's move on. This is pressing, let's get through it, and then let's get back to it.
Yeah. And I think that's important, like as men, like to not just say like, okay, I'm going to do a fire sale of all these like the conventional wisdom of what it means to be a man, because that obviously came from somewhere that either through adversity or something really, really genuine. So I don't think it makes sense to just say none of that stuff works, and we need to completely reinvent what it means to be a man. And so I think it's like the question is, and what else? Like, yes, we need to get this done right now in 30 minutes, and we don't have the time to, if we were to fully switch gears and talk about our emotions and feelings about what's going on, we might not make the deadline.
Yeah.
So what is the in between? Is there a both and option?
Yeah. I'm reminded of this analogy about luggage and unpacking and repacking luggage. I don't know if I know, Brian, you used to travel a lot. I think you probably still do, at least a little bit, right? David, do you travel a lot?
Relatively, yeah.
So, that moment between trips where you are unpacking your luggage from the last trip, figuring out what to do, what to pack for the next trip. You know that moment?
Yeah, I do. Yep.
It's like, just for me, the most uncomfortable moment, because I'm sort of still literally carrying the baggage from the last experience and trying to prepare for the next. It just reminded me of these kind of conflict, disagreement type conversations. You are literally trying to unpack all of the baggage from that comes from your past disagreements, that comes from your relationship as a whole, and then repack for a new destination. And sometimes it's really urgent that you have to repack for that new destination, whether it's finding a solution to a household disagreement, or what Thai place are we going to order from tonight. Finding a new solution is that repacking. And it's really, really difficult to do both at once. Then you just end up with dirty socks everywhere, and nobody wants that. Anyway, let's repack for our final question here. So our next destination is
Can I say something about that really quick?
Yeah.
Because I want to relate it back to something that Brian said early on around men feeling isolated, actually. And I think at the heart of it is actually this sort of like accumulation of baggage and nowhere to like lay it down or talk about it, or nowhere to see or to be seen for the baggage that has been carried on along the way for so long and accumulated. Like my father, he's in his mid 60s, and he's considering retirement in the next couple of years. And I saw him go through sort of like a dry spell of isolation, where he would just spend a lot of his time going to work and then going home and then reading the news and then stuck glued to the TV screen right? And a couple of years ago, I had a conversation with him about that. I asked him specifically, I said, like, hey, like, I know there's been a lot of challenges happening at home. At the time, my mom was sick with the chronic condition, and her outlook was pretty bleak at the time. And so I had asked him, can you tell me a little bit more about like what's behind, you watching YouTube all the time, even in a house full of people, right? Like full of people ready to like connect, play, have fun, interact. Yet you, in that environment, you were sort of like isolating yourself. Like, what is that? And I just made a guess. I asked them, is it, are you having a hard time coping with the sadness that's happening with mom and the disconnect? And I just saw him break down in tears after that. I just saw him break down in tears, and he just acknowledged like, yeah, actually, yeah, I am. Right. And so over the course of the next few years, I saw my dad like start to slowly open up about his past. Like, all I wanted from my mom was nurturance. All I wanted was to hug my mom one last time, to see her, despite her leaving, when I was young, and to not be prideful and see her one last time before she passed. And I didn't get that chance, and the outcome of him sort of like revealing what he's been holding and carrying and spending time on that, I've never seen my dad more like happy, more like full of life and social actually, and willing to sort of engage in the community and ask like, how can I be involved? How can I contribute? So anyways, I just wanted to tie it back to sort of isolation.
Poignant. Truly poignant. Thank you. I appreciate all the personal and professional anecdotes that you've shared tonight. David, have been so useful to me personally. I know to Brian as well.
Yeah.
The last question we have is just about what strategies, in addition to all of the wealth of strategies that you've shared already, can husbands, partners use to make space for their partners in a marriage? Interested to hear from you, how husbands can team up with their spouses, their significant others, and work towards a lifetime of experiences together.
Yeah, I think there's so many ways to answer that question, but I'll answer it like, short of providing like a laundry list of things. I think the thing that comes to mind is to check for understanding, check for meaning with your partner. You talk about like, how do you make space for a successful partnership? I think if 9 times out of 10, my partner feels that our team is stable and strong and feels inspired when she has an experience where I'm actually curious that what she said is what she meant, or how she feels is actually how I'm interpreting it. And just simply acknowledging that.
Yeah,
I would say that's like probably the most important thing, in my opinion.
So they feel heard, right? I mean, that's, I remember, I think it was my father that told me, when you're talking to someone and, the conversation matters, you should act as an investigative reporter, to try to fully understand what they're driving at, what it is that they want, what they're feeling. And, I always felt like that was a pretty good approach, but, in the workplace, right. To understand whether it's your customer, your colleagues, or whatever it may be. But what I'm hearing from you, that it's absolutely essential in a relationship with a partner.
Yeah. Yeah.
Brian, you famously carry around audio recorder, asking Hope questions. Your thoughts on this, Hope? Your thoughts on this? You're
That's great.
pretty dogged reporter.
That's, well, you can see those on my TikTok, and she always loves it, as you will find out. I still can't get her to answer what we're having for dinner, or what she would like for dinner, I should say. Wow, this has been really great. I appreciate, it was like nugget after nugget of wisdom, and thoughtful conversation, particularly for me, because I do come from I don't know if it's more generational or if it's more where I'm from, but I don't do a great job of really fully understanding my partner whenever there's a problem, and I try to drive straight through this what the solution should be, and I know that's healthy. I've learned that, or that's unhealthy. I've learned that ultimately, the best solution, the fastest solution is to listen, is to be empathetic, is to make sure your partner feels like they've been heard, and that if there's something pressing right now, that it's okay to say, hey, look, let's kind of put a pin in this. Let's recognize that we're frustrated, and let's recognize that this is important, but we just can't solve it now. We have to solve something a little bit different, and that, I think that in itself is going to help me in our relationship. So really appreciate your time today.
Christian, Dr. Ross, and I thank our listeners and our guest. Please be sure to go to modernhusbands.com, where you can subscribe to our podcast. You can listen to our podcast in whatever platform you prefer: Apple, Spotify, Amazon Music, or even on YouTube. Until next time, be well.